Okay, now let's talk about drafting your essay. It's important that you approach this in chunks. Don't try to sit there and pre-write and then immediately start writing your essay. Why don't you first do your pre-writing? You write, then maybe you cluster, maybe you have a talk with a friend until you come up with what your idea is, your main point. And then you're ready to start thinking about a draft, to start planning a draft. To plan for a draft, keep in mind what you're trying to do. You're trying to tell a story. So you have your main point, and your story is going to support that main point. So I think what you should do is realize that a good story usually starts with a conflict of some kind that you then work on resolving throughout the essay. A good story provides specific examples and details that really speak to the audience. So you want to consider your audience before you start writing. Okay, now with that said, I think the best thing to do is come up with a list or an outline. As you do this, you want to think about the story. If you start with a conflict of some kind, you want to make the conflict worsen, or build and build and build and build until it's resolved. This is true whether your story is funny or sad. For example, in David Sedaris's Me Talk Pretty Someday, his story it's funny, it's a comedy, but it starts with a conflict. He's moved to France, he doesn't speak French, and he needs to speak French in order to survive in his new home, and he's intimidated by his teacher or his class and learning another language. So the conflict is presented at the very beginning, and the story, the conflict continues to worsen and worsen as the teacher becomes more and more aggressive and hostile. So even though it's a funny story, the conflict does worsen, and when it reaches sort of an apex, it's at that point that he is able to begin resolving the conflict, when he shifts his focus away from the teacher and onto his own learning. So consider, what kind of conflict are you going to work with, and then how can you work through it? Another thing to keep in mind, for example, in What's in a Name, Gates, his father is confronted by a derogatory term. The issue of derogatory names or terms is raised right at the beginning of the essay. So the conflict is presented at the beginning of the essay, and then Gates builds into the story that deals with the conflict slowly. And that moment of the most discomfort is when his father is confronted with the name, and the boy asks him, "Dad, why don't you tell him your name?" And that is what leads to the resolution to that conflict. And the resolution is simply an exploration of the injustice of the experience. It's not a tidy ending, it's just an exploration into, what a name means and how a name can be unjust, and it can reflect societal injustice. And so it results in a lesson about society and challenging societal assumptions. So start to plan the conflict and how that conflict will be resolved, and I'll be with you for the next session soon.